Hi, I'm Evelyn Parker, and I'm 31 years old. For most of my life, I thought my sister's words were the sharpest weapons in my family's arsenal. But I was wrong. The deadliest weapon was my parents' silence. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. The clinking of silverware on porcelain plates felt unnaturally loud. At our table, in the center of a crowded restaurant, a bubble of silence had formed around us. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I could feel the eyes of my extended family on me, aunts, uncles, cousins, all waiting to see how I would react. Across the table, my sister Danielle held her wine glass by the stem, a picture of polished perfection. A smirk played on her lips as she looked at me, her eyes cold and dismissive. "You've always been the failure, Evelyn," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. It wasn't a shout. It was worse. It was a calm, factual statement, delivered as if she were commenting on the weather. "I can't believe you're even still sitting here like you belong." The words hit me, but they were a familiar sting. I had been deflecting her barbs my entire life. My head instinctively turned to my parents, my mother on my right, my father on my left. I searched their faces for a flicker of defense, a word of protest, anything to show me I wasn't alone. Nothing. My mother's eyes dropped to the perfectly folded napkin in her lap. She smoothed it out, her fingers pressing down on a non-existent crease. My father cleared his throat and took a slow sip of water, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. Their lips were sealed. Their bodies were still. They were letting it happen. They were agreeing with her, and in that moment I understood. That silence, the heavy, suffocating absence of their support, cut deeper than her words ever could. It was an answer, and it told me everything I needed to know. If you've ever felt crushed by the silence of the people who should have defended you, hit like, comment, and subscribe. Because this is the story of how I learned to build a life out of the rubble they left behind. Growing up in our house was like living in a constant, unspoken competition that I was destined to lose. My sister Danielle was 4 years older, and from the moment I was born, she was the sun, and I was just a planet caught in her orbit. She was the one they pinned all their hopes on. She was bright, she was ambitious, and she was beautiful in that effortless way that made people stop and look. I was quiet, I was creative, and in their eyes I was simply other. Our home wasn't a place of equal opportunity. It was a kingdom, and Danielle was the designated heir. I was just a member of the court, expected to applaud her ascension. The defining moment, the one that drew a clear, unerasable line between us, came the year Danielle was accepted into a prestigious private university on the East Coast. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a thick, cream-colored envelope that felt important, even before it was opened. My mother spotted it in the mail pile and her breath hitched. She carried it into the house with the reverence of a priest carrying a sacred text, placing it in the center of the dining room table to await Danielle's return from her after-school debate club. When Danielle finally swept through the door, my mother's anxious energy filled the room. "It's here," she whispered, pointing at the envelope. I was sitting on the couch trying to read a book, but the tension was too thick to concentrate. My father came in from the garage, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, his eyes also fixed on the envelope. Danielle, ever the performer, made a show of it. She slowly picked it up, weighed it in her hand, and smiled a confident, knowing smile. "Thick envelopes are a good sign," she declared. She slid it open with one of our mother's silver letter openers, pulled out the heavy cardstock, and began to read aloud. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the undercurrent of triumph in her tone. When she got to the words, "It is with great pleasure that we offer you admission," a cheer erupted in our living room. It was a loud, joyous, unrestrained sound that I had never heard in our house before. My father, a man who rarely showed physical affection, lifted Danielle off the ground, spinning her around in a dizzying circle while she laughed, her hair fanning out around her. It was like a scene from a movie. My mother burst into happy tears, dabbing her eyes with a tissue she pulled from her sleeve. "I knew it! I always knew it!" she repeated over and over again. They hugged, a tight circle of victory, and for a moment, they seemed to forget I was even in the room. I sat on the couch, a forgotten ghost, watching the celebration of the chosen one. That night, they took us out to the most expensive restaurant in town to celebrate. They ordered a bottle of champagne, even letting Danielle have a small glass. My father stood, raising his glass for a toast, his face flushed with pride. "To Danielle," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our brilliant daughter, the future CEO. We always knew you were a good investment. A good investment." The words echoed in my head, cold and clinical. Danielle was an investment. Something you pour resources into with the expectation of a profitable return. It wasn't about love or support. It was about the potential for status, for bragging rights, for a return that would reflect well on them. And me? I was just there, a silent spectator to the transaction. Later that night, I overheard them talking in their bedroom, their voices low but clear through the thin walls. "We'll have to tighten our belts," my father said. "But it's worth it. An education like that sets her up for life. She'll make us proud," my mother agreed. "She'll be the success story of this family." No one ever talked about my future in those terms. My future was an afterthought. 4 years later, the contrast was stark and brutal. My own acceptance letter came in a standard, flimsy white envelope from the local community college. I had worked hard for it. My grades were good, my application essays carefully written. It was a step, a start, and I was proud of it. I found my parents in the kitchen. My mother was chopping vegetables for dinner. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the knife on the cutting board, a steady, relentless beat. My father was at the table, hidden behind the rustling pages of the evening newspaper. I held up the letter, a nervous smile on my face. "I got in," I said, my voice sounding small in the cavernous silence of the kitchen. My mother didn't stop chopping. She didn't even look up. "That's nice, dear," she said, her voice flat. The knife continued its work without a single pause. Thump, thump, thump. My father lowered his paper just enough for me to see his eyes over the top. He gave me a tired, distracted smile. "Well, it's practical. Good for you for being practical, Evelyn." He then lifted the paper back up, disappearing behind a wall of newsprint. The conversation was over. Practical. That was the word they reserved for me. Danielle was an investment. I was practical. Danielle was brilliant. I was nice. There was no celebratory dinner, no toast, no spinning me around in the living room. It was just another piece of information that passed through our house with little fanfare, like announcing we were out of milk. The subject of tuition came up a week later. They sat me down and explained in calm, reasonable tones that their savings were gone. Danielle's elite education had taken everything. "We invested in her future," my father said, as if that explained everything. "It's your turn to be practical now." So I was. I got 2 jobs, my life shrinking into a grueling routine of exhaustion. From 7 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, I worked as a cashier at a dingy, perpetually sticky diner downtown. The owner, a gruff man named Sal, was always yelling. The air was always thick with the smell of grease and burnt coffee, and my feet ached from standing for hours on the hard linoleum floor. I dealt with rude customers, cleaned up spilled sodas, and counted out change with fingers that always felt slightly greasy. I'd come home for an hour, just enough time to shower the diner smell off me and eat a sandwich standing over the sink. Then, I would head to my second job at a retail store in the mall, where I'd fold sweaters and stock shelves until 10 at night. The work was mindless, a blur of neatly stacked denim and perfectly aligned t-shirts. The fluorescent lights gave me headaches, and the cheerful pop music that played on a loop felt like a special kind of torture. I was missing out on my life. My friends would call, asking me to go to a movie or just hang out, and I would always have to say no. "I have to work," became my constant refrain. Danielle, meanwhile, was living a life I could only imagine. She'd call me sometimes, usually from a party or a trendy cafe, her voice bright and carefree. She'd complain about her classes being too boring, or a boy from her sorority mixer being annoying. Her problems felt like luxuries to me. One afternoon, while I was on my 15-minute break at the diner, huddled in the back alley trying to eat my sad. "Packed lunch," she called me. "Oh my God, Evie. You won't believe the drama," she said, her voice full of theatrical despair. "Ashley wore the same dress as me to the formal. Can you believe her nerve?" I looked at my hands. The grime from the cash register lodged under my fingernails. I could hear the clatter of plates and Sal yelling an order from inside. "That sounds tough, Danny," I said, my voice flat with a weariness she could never understand. The one thing that kept me sane was my art. It was my only escape, my sanctuary. In the few precious hours I had between work and sleep, I would draw and paint. It was the only time I felt like myself, the only time the world felt quiet and right. I thought, naively, that if I could just show them my passion, show them something I was truly good at, they might finally see me. An opportunity arose when my community college hosted a student art show. I submitted a charcoal portrait I had done of an old man I'd often see sitting on a park bench near the diner. I had spent weeks on it, capturing every line on his face, the weariness in his eyes, and the quiet dignity in his posture. To my astonishment, it was not only accepted, but also awarded an honorable mention. I was ecstatic. It was the first real validation I had ever received for my work. I invited my parents to the opening reception. I begged them to come. It's really important to me, I told them. They agreed, though without much enthusiasm. They arrived late. I had been standing by my portrait for over an hour, nervously scanning the crowd for them. When they finally walked in, they looked uncomfortable, out of place among the students and art enthusiasts. I led them to my piece, my heart pounding with a desperate hope. My father peered at it over his glasses. "You've got a good eye," he admitted, the same line he always used. "Very realistic." My mother smiled a tight, polite smile. "It's a very nice hobby, Evelyn. You're lucky you have something to keep you busy." Hobby. The word was a slap. This wasn't a hobby. It was the most important thing in the world to me. They stayed for a total of 10 minutes. They did a quick, cursory walk around the small gallery, nodded politely at a few other pieces, and then my mother checked her watch. "We should get going," she said. "We have to be at that fundraiser for Danielle's University Alumni Association. It's a very important networking event for her." And that was it. My moment of triumph, the honorable mention, the pride I felt, it was all eclipsed by one of Danielle's networking events. They left, leaving me standing alone by my portrait, the small blue ribbon for honorable mention suddenly feeling flimsy and meaningless. They had drawn the line so clearly. Danielle was the daughter they bragged about, the one whose achievements were celebrated and magnified. I was the daughter they tolerated, the practical one, the one whose passions were childish hobbies. They never said they loved her more. They didn't have to. Their actions, their priorities, and their silences said it for them, every single day, in 1,000 different ways. After I finished my 2-year program at community college, the weight of my student loans felt like a physical burden. I had a certificate in graphic design, but the world wasn't exactly beating a path to my door. Entry-level jobs were scarce, and the ones I could find paid so little that living on my own was a financial fantasy. The practical choice, the only choice I really had, was to move back into my childhood bedroom with its faded floral wallpaper and ghosts of a life I was trying to outgrow. My parents framed it as a favor, an act of parental generosity. "You can stay here and save up," my mother said, a tone of magnanimity in her voice that set my teeth on edge. "It will be much easier for you to get on your feet this way." But this generosity came with a price tag. A week after I moved my boxes back in, my father sat me down at the kitchen table. The scene was oddly formal, as if I were a prospective tenant and he were the landlord laying down the terms of the lease. "Now, Evelyn," he began, folding his hands on the table, "you're an adult now, and you need to understand how the world works. We can't just support you indefinitely. You have to contribute." He slid a piece of paper across the table. On it, he had itemized my share of the household expenses, utilities, groceries, property taxes. It all added up to $600 a month. "We're giving you a good rate," he said, his voice full of forced reason. "It's much less than you'd pay for a proper apartment. This is to teach you responsibility." Responsibility. The word hung in the air between us. I was already drowning in responsibility, working a full-time, low-wage design job and picking up freelance projects at night to make a dent in my student loans. But I didn't argue. I just nodded, the humiliation a bitter taste in my mouth. So, on the first of every month, I would perform the quiet, degrading ritual of writing a check to my own parents. I would leave it on the kitchen counter for my mother, who would pick it up without comment and tuck it into her purse. It was a clean, business-like transaction that reinforced my status in the house. I was not their daughter. Not really. I was a boarder. My presence was conditional, my space paid for. The cruelty of this arrangement was amplified by Danielle's situation. Just a few months after I moved back in, my parents announced over dinner that they were buying a condo for her in the city. It wasn't a loan, it was a gift. They paid the hefty down payment and co-signed the mortgage, the monthly payments of which they also helped her with, a euphemism I knew meant they were paying for most of it. One Saturday, I was sitting at the kitchen table, sketching in my notepad, when my mother came in, phone pressed to her ear. It was Danielle. And from my mother's side of the conversation, I could piece together the details of her lavish new life. "Oh, the gray marble backsplash sounds gorgeous, sweetie. Yes, of course your father and I will pay for the interior decorator. You need the place to look perfect. No, don't worry about the condo fees. We'll handle it for the first year until you get your big promotion." My pencil froze on the page. I looked down at the checkbook on the counter, the next rent check for my parents already written out and waiting. The injustice of it was a physical thing, a tightening in my chest that made it hard to breathe. Danielle was living in a beautiful, modern apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and a decorator, all funded by them, while I was in my childhood bedroom, counting every dollar to make sure I could pay my own parents for the privilege of existing in their home. When I tried to talk to them about it later that evening, to express the unfairness I felt, they shut me down with practiced ease. "Danielle's situation is different, Evelyn," my mother said, her voice cool and distant, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "She has a high-pressure career at a major firm. She needs a stable place to live, a good address for entertaining clients. It's an investment in her future." There was that word again. Investment. Danielle was a blue-chip stock they kept pouring money into, expecting it to grow. I was a junk bond, a risky, low-yield asset they were barely willing to hold on to. Living under their roof as a rent-paying adult was a suffocating experience. My life felt like it was under a microscope. Every purchase was scrutinized, every decision quietly judged. If I bought a new sweater, my mother would raise an eyebrow and say, "Must be nice to have money for things like that. Make sure you have enough for rent." If I came home late from a rare evening out with a friend, my father would be waiting up in his armchair in the dark living room, not out of concern, but with an air of silent disapproval, as if I were a teenager who had broken curfew. My achievements, small as they might have seemed to them, continued to be invisible. The brightest spot in my life was the free after-school art workshop I started at a local community center. The center was in a rough part of town, and the kids who came had very little. But in that small, paint-splattered room, they were artists. Their joy and uninhibited creativity were a balm to my soul. It was the most fulfilling thing I had ever done, the one place where I felt valued and seen. I was making a difference. I'll never forget one particular afternoon. A little boy named Leo, who barely spoke a word, had spent a month working on a detailed clay model of his dog. He was so incredibly proud of it. When he finished, he looked up at me with shining eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Miss Evelyn." It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. I came home that evening, my heart full, desperate to share this small victory with my family. I found them in the living room watching television. "You won't believe what happened at the workshop today," I started, my voice full of an energy that felt foreign in that quiet, sterile house. I told them about Leo, about his breakthrough, about the pride on his face. I tried to convey the magic of the moment. My mother glanced at me, her eyes glazed over from the screen. "Oh, that's sweet," she said, her attention already drifting back to the crime drama she was watching. "It's good you have something to keep you busy." "Did Danielle call?" my father asked, not taking his eyes off the television. "She was supposed to be interviewing for a new position today, a senior role. I've been waiting to hear how it went. That girl is going places." And just like that, my moment was gone. My story, my joy, was nothing more than a brief interruption before they returned to what was really important. Danielle. My passion was just something to keep me busy, while Danielle's career was a subject of breathless anticipation. I stood there for a moment, the excitement draining out of me, replaced by a familiar hollow ache. I went up to my room and closed the door, the sound of the television a dull murmur from downstairs. It was like I was a ghost in my own home, my passions and successes completely transparent to them. Family gatherings became exercises in humiliation. Thanksgiving was the worst. The entire extended family would convene at our house, and the spotlight was always, inevitably, on Danielle. She would hold court at the dinner table, strategically seated in the place of honor next to my father. Aunts and uncles would gather around her, listening with rapt attention as she talked about her work, her trips to Europe, her sophisticated life. "Oh, Danielle, you're doing so well. Your parents must be so proud," my Aunt Carol would gush, her eyes wide with admiration. They would all nod in agreement, their faces beaming. Then, one of them might notice me sitting at the far end of the table next to the kids' table. "And Evelyn," they would say, their tone shifting to one of polite, almost pitying, inquiry. "What are you up to these days? Still living at home? Still doing art?" The word art was always said with a slight hesitation, as if it were a strange, embarrassing ailment. One year, my cousin Mark, who was around Danielle's age, asked me about my freelance design work. I started to explain a project I was excited about, designing a logo for a small local bakery. Before I could get 2 sentences out, Danielle laughed from the other end of the table. "Oh, she makes pretty pictures for cupcake shops," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "It's cute," everyone chuckled, and the conversation immediately shifted back to Danielle's latest 6-figure deal. I sat there, my face burning, my half-told story dying on my lips. My parents said nothing. They smiled along with everyone else, their silence a tacit agreement with Danielle's condescending summary of my life. I wasn't just invisible to my parents, They had taught everyone else not to see me either. I was the family's resident child, the cautionary tale, the daughter who hadn't quite launched. Danielle was the success story they all celebrated. I was the footnote they felt obligated to acknowledge before turning their attention back to the main event. The day of my father's birthday dinner began with a familiar sense of dread. These family celebrations were never about the person being celebrated. They were command performances, stages set for my sister Danielle to shine. I spent the afternoon wrestling with my anxiety, trying to find an outfit that would make me feel less like a ghost at the feast. Everything I owned felt inadequate, either too casual or too plain. I finally settled on a simple black dress, the one I wore to every formal occasion, a uniform of invisibility. As I got ready, my mind replayed a highlight reel of past humiliations. The time Danielle had announced my salary, which she had snooped to find out, to a table full of relatives, comparing it pitifully to her own. The time my mother had given me a self-help book for my birthday titled Finding Your Path. Every memory was a small stone in the foundation of my insecurity, a foundation my family had expertly laid. I felt a strong urge to call and say I was sick, to invent a migraine or a stomach bug, but I knew the fallout would be worse. My absence would be noted and judged. I would be accused of being antisocial, of not caring about the family. It was easier to just go and endure it. The restaurant my parents had chosen was new and oppressively trendy. It was all dark wood, low lighting, and hushed, important-sounding conversations. The air smelled of garlic, wine, and money. When I arrived, my parents were already there, seated at a large round table with the rest of the family. My father was in a crisp suit, and my mother wore a silk blouse and a string of pearls. They looked like a power couple, confident and serene. Danielle, of course, arrived late. She made a grand entrance, sweeping in with a dramatic apology about a last-minute conference call with the London office. She was wearing a stunning red dress that made every other woman in the room look drab. She carried a designer handbag that probably cost more than my monthly salary. My parents' faces lit up when they saw her. All the tension of waiting for her melted away, replaced by pure, unadulterated adoration. "There's my girl," my father boomed, standing up to give her a hug that was far more effusive than the polite peck on the cheek he had given me. "You look stunning, sweetie," my mother added, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "Red is your color." The conversation, as always, orbited around Danielle. She was a master storyteller, spinning tales of boardroom battles she had won, incompetent colleagues she had outsmarted, and a potential promotion that was all but guaranteed. My parents and relatives were her captive audience, hanging on her every word, nodding and smiling, interjecting with questions designed to let her brag even more. "And what did the vice president say when you presented your findings?" my father would ask, leaning forward with the intense interest of a devoted fan. I sat there, a silent observer, methodically pushing a piece of ravioli around my plate. No one asked about my week. No one asked about the new freelance project I had just landed, designing the entire branding package for a local startup, a gig I was incredibly proud of. It was as if I were a stranger who had been mistakenly seated at their table, a piece of living scenery. I tried once to join the conversation. My uncle was talking about the stock market, and I mentioned an article I had read about tech stocks. Before I could finish my sentence, Danielle cut me off with a laugh. "Oh, Evelyn, it's sweet that you try to keep up, but let's leave the financial talk to the people who actually understand it." My father chuckled in agreement. The conversation moved on, leaving me stranded in a fresh wave of humiliation. After the main course was cleared, Danielle leaned back in her chair, a self-satisfied smile on her face. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her expensive red wine and set the glass down with a delicate click. The table fell silent, sensing a proclamation was coming. "So I have some exciting news," she announced, her eyes sweeping across her audience. "I've decided to buy a new condo. My current place is just too small, and I found the most perfect two-bedroom in the Pearl District. It has a view of the city, a gym, a concierge. It's a major step up." A chorus of congratulations erupted around the table. "Oh, darling, that's wonderful," my mother exclaimed, clapping her hands together softly. "That's my girl. Always moving up in the world," my father said, beaming with a pride so intense it was almost painful to watch. Danielle let their praise wash over her for a moment, basking in the attention. Then her gaze shifted, moving deliberately around the table until it landed, with chilling precision, on me. The smile on her face transformed, the warmth draining away, leaving something sharp and cruel in its place. "It's a bit of a stretch financially, of course," she continued, her voice taking on a performative, thoughtful tone. "The down payment is significant, so I was thinking, As a family, we could all pitch in. It would be an investment for all of us, really. Her eyes locked with mine. And I was thinking, she said, her voice dripping with a syrupy, condescending sweetness, that Evelyn could make a nice contribution. Say $15,000? A nervous laugh rippled through our relatives at the table. They thought she was making a joke, a bit of sisterly ribbing. I knew better. This was not a joke. It was an execution. Her voice grew louder, cutting through the awkward chuckles. After all, she declared, her tone turning accusatory, you've been living off mom and dad like a parasite for years. You don't have a mortgage. You don't have any real expenses. It's about time you did something to help the family instead of just draining resources. Parasite. The word was a physical blow. It seemed to suck all the air out of the room. My face burned with a heat so intense I thought I might actually combust. I felt dizzy, the sounds of the restaurant fading into a low, roaring hum in my ears. My first instinct, my only instinct, was to look at my parents. My eyes, wide with shock and pain, pleaded with them. Say something, defend me. Tell her she's wrong. Tell her I pay rent. Tell her I work hard. Tell her I'm your daughter. I looked at my mother. Her eyes dropped to the perfectly folded napkin in her lap. She picked it up and began smoothing it out, her fingers pressing down on a non-existent crease over and over again. Her focus on this meaningless task was absolute. She would not meet my eyes. Her face was a blank mask, a carefully constructed wall of neutrality, betraying nothing, offering nothing. I turned to my father. He cleared his throat, a loud, rasping sound in the sudden silence. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He picked up his water glass, his knuckles white as he gripped the stem. He studied it for a long, agonizing moment, as if it were the most fascinating object he had ever seen. Then he set it down again very carefully. He looked at my uncle, who was sitting across from him, and forced a tight, unnatural smile, a grimace that didn't reach his eyes. He was pretending he hadn't heard. He was choosing not to hear. He was abandoning me in plain sight. Their silence was deafening. It was a roar that filled my ears and drowned out everything else. It wasn't just a failure to defend me. It was a silent, damning endorsement of Danielle's words. Their stillness was their agreement. In that moment, sitting at a table surrounded by family, under the glittering chandeliers of a fancy restaurant, I had never felt more utterly and completely alone. Danielle's cruelty was a sharp, quick wound, but my parents' silence was a slow-acting poison, seeping into every part of me, telling me that my sister was right. I didn't belong here. I never had. The world seemed to fracture in that moment of silence. The background chatter of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, the distant laughter from another table, it all shattered and fell away, leaving me isolated in a vacuum of betrayal. The only thing that felt real was the crushing weight of my parents' silence. It wasn't a passive absence of sound. It was an active, suffocating force. It was a decision. They had heard the accusation, they had seen my pain, and they had chosen to do nothing. Their stillness was a verdict, and I had been found guilty of being exactly what Danielle had called me, a worthless parasite. Danielle saw my desperation. She saw me looking from our mother's downcast eyes to our father's averted face, searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. A triumphant, predatory gleam lit her eyes. This was her victory, and she was going to savor it. She leaned forward, placing her elbows on the white tablecloth, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was intentionally loud enough for everyone to hear. See? She taunted, a cruel smile playing on her lips. Even mom and dad know you're nothing. They don't argue because they know I'm right. You're a charity case, Evelyn. You always have been. Her words were meant to be the final blow, the killing strike that would make me crumble. But the truth was they barely registered. The real damage had already been done, a mortal wound inflicted not by her words, but by their silence. My parents' refusal to speak for me had hollowed me out, leaving me empty and echoing with a pain so profound it had no sound. Their silence had validated every cruel word Danielle had ever said to me, every dismissive comment, every belittling glance. It reached back through my entire life, retroactively confirming my deepest, darkest fear that in their eyes, my worth was conditional, and I had never managed to meet the conditions. I felt like a child again, but the memory was sharper, more vivid than ever before. I was 6 years old, standing in the hallway, shaking, as Danielle explained to our parents how I had taken our mother's favorite porcelain vase and smashed it on the floor. I hadn't touched it. Danielle had knocked it over while chasing the cat, but she had pointed her finger at me, her face a perfect mask of innocence. I had tried to tell them the truth, my voice small and trembling. I didn't do it, it was Danny. But they hadn't listened. They had looked from her convincing, tear-filled eyes to my panicked, stammering ones, and had made their choice. They always made their choice. They sent me to my room without supper, their faces set with disappointment in me, not for breaking the vase, but for lying about it. I had sat on my bed, choking on sobs of helplessness, feeling the profound injustice of being unheard, of being unseen. Now, 25 years later at this dinner table, that same suffocating feeling washed over me, but this time it was 100 times more potent. I wasn't a child anymore. I was a woman who paid her own bills, who contributed to their household, who had built a life and a career from scratch with no help from them. Yet, they still had the power to reduce me to that helpless 6-year-old girl, silenced and powerless. I held back my tears. It was an act of pure will. I would not give Danielle the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I would not give my parents the release of my emotional breakdown. I clenched my fists under the table, my nails digging so hard into my palms that I was sure I had drawn blood. The small, sharp pain was an anchor, a welcome distraction from the enormous, formless ache in my chest. I stared at my plate, at the swirl of sauce left from my meal, focusing on it with an intensity that bordered on madness. It was an abstract pattern of red and brown. If I could just focus on the plate, on the meaningless pattern, maybe I wouldn't shatter into a million pieces. My mother finally stirred. It was the first movement she had made since the attack began. She picked up her purse from the floor and placed it in her lap, a mundane, ordinary action that felt grotesquely out of place in the middle of my silent breakdown. She adjusted the strap. She smoothed the leather. She did not look at me. She looked at Danielle, her expression carefully neutral. "Well?" she said, her voice bright and brittle, a sound as fake as a plastic flower. She was completely ignoring the emotional carnage that had just taken place. "Shall we have dessert? I hear their tiramisu is divine." It was the final, most profound betrayal of the night. She wasn't just silent. She was actively trying to erase the moment, to paper over the gaping wound with the triviality of dessert. She was smoothing things over, not for my sake, but to restore the comfortable family harmony where Danielle was praised and I was invisible. My pain was an inconvenience, a messy little spill that needed to be wiped away so the party could continue. She was telling me, without saying a word, that my feelings did not matter. The rest of the dinner passed in a thick, surreal fog. I don't remember what anyone said. I don't remember if I ate dessert. I remember the waiter coming over, his cheerful face an insult to my grief. I remember the feeling of being trapped in my own body, a prisoner behind my own eyes, watching a play in which I had no lines. I was a spectator to my own public execution. The air was thick with everyone's desperate attempt to pretend that nothing had happened. They talked about the weather, about sports, about a movie someone had seen. The sheer effort of their determined normalcy was exhausting to witness. The car ride home was a study in suffocation. The three of us, my father driving, my mother in the passenger seat, and me in the back, a prisoner in transit, sat in a thick, heavy silence. It was a different kind of silence now. At the restaurant, it had been the silence of agreement and abandonment. Now it was the silence of guilt and avoidance. They knew what they had done, or rather, what they had failed to do. They knew they had betrayed me, and the air in the car was choked with their unspoken shame. But their shame wasn't an apology. It wasn't comfort. It was just another layer of my isolation. My father turned on the radio, filling the car with soft jazz, a pathetic attempt to fill the void he had helped create. When we got home, I walked straight past them, up the stairs to my bedroom, the room I paid rent for. I didn't say goodnight. They didn't either. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, the wood cool against my hot back. And then, in the privacy of my rented space within my parents' house, I finally let myself break. The tears came hot and silent. They weren't loud, hiccuping sobs of anger. They were the quiet, hopeless tears of someone who had finally, irrevocably, accepted a terrible truth. My sister didn't crush me that night. She couldn't have done it on her own. She had simply loaded the gun and aimed it. My parents were the ones who pulled the trigger. They held me down with their silence and let her deliver the blow. They were the ones who truly broke my heart. And as I sat there in the dark, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that nothing would ever be the same again. That night, after the silent car ride home and the lonely tears in my rented room, I reached a bottom I didn't know existed. The pain was a physical thing, a cold, heavy weight in the center of my chest. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene at the restaurant over and over again. Every detail was seared into my memory. Danielle's cruel smirk, my mother's fascination with her napkin, my father's determined study of his water glass. Their betrayal wasn't a single act, but the culmination of 1,000 tiny cuts inflicted over a lifetime. They had finally severed the last fraying thread of hope I had that they would one day see me, that they would one day choose me. In that profound darkness, a different memory began to surface, a pinpoint of light in the vast emptiness. It was the memory of my grandmother, my mother's mother, a woman who had been my only real ally. Grandma Rose was nothing like her daughter. Where my mother was reserved and judgmental, my grandmother was warm and expansive. Her house smelled of cinnamon and yeast, and her kitchen was a place of comforting chaos. She was the only person who had ever looked at my artwork with genuine interest, not as a hobby, but as a gift. I remembered sitting at her worn wooden kitchen table when I was a teenager, showing her my sketchbook. She had looked through every page slowly and carefully. When she was done, she had closed the book, placed her wrinkled hand over mine, and looked me straight in the eye. "Evelyn, my dear," she had said, her voice soft but firm, "you have a fire in you. Don't ever let anyone mistake it for smoke." She had looked at me then with a knowing sadness. "Your parents, they love you in their way, but they are blind to certain kinds of light. They only see the kind that glitters. Your light is the kind that warms. They may never understand that. The most important thing is that you understand it." My grandmother had passed away 2 years ago. It had been a quiet, devastating loss. A few weeks after the funeral, I had received a call from a lawyer, her executor. He had asked me to come to his office alone. I had assumed it was a small sentiment, a piece of jewelry she might have left for me. I was wrong. The lawyer had handed me a thick envelope. Inside was a personal letter from my grandmother and a check for $200,000. I sat in my car in the law office parking lot for over an hour, reading and rereading her letter, the check lying on the passenger seat like an impossible dream. Her handwriting, a familiar, elegant cursive, was a voice from the beyond. "My dearest Evelyn," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, but I am not leaving you alone. I have watched you your entire life. I have seen your quiet strength, your boundless kindness, and the beautiful, vibrant world that lives inside you. I have also seen how your family has tried to dim your light. They don't mean to be cruel. They are simply limited. They measure worth in dollars and promotions, and they do not have the vision to see the immeasurable value of a soul like yours. I am leaving you this money not as a handout, but as a tool, a key. Use it to build a door out of the room they have locked you in, and then build a whole new house for yourself, one where your light can fill every corner. Don't tell them about it. This is yours alone. Let it be your secret, your strength. Hold on until it's your time. You will know when that is. Build your own future, my sweet girl. They will never see your worth, but I did, and I always will." The tears I cried then were not tears of grief, but of overwhelming, gut-wrenching gratitude. Someone had seen me. Someone had truly, completely seen me, and she had given me a key. For 2 years, I had held on to that secret. I had followed her instructions to the letter. I met with a financial advisor, a kind woman who helped me invest the money wisely and safely. I continued to live at home, paying my rent, enduring the dismissals and the invisibility. But now, something inside me had shifted. Their opinions still hurt, but they no longer defined me. I had a secret world, a future that was mine alone. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a quiet revolutionary, plotting my independence in silence. 6 months ago, I had started looking at real estate. The idea had been terrifying at first, but with every listing I viewed, a sense of empowerment grew within me. I wasn't looking for a fancy condo like Danielle's. I was looking for a home, a sanctuary. And then I found it. A small duplex in a quiet, leafy neighborhood on the other side of town. It was old and needed some work, but it had good bones and a small, overgrown garden in the back. One unit was a one-bedroom apartment I could live in. The other was a small storefront with a large open room and big windows, a perfect ready-made art studio and classroom space. The process of buying it was my secret rebellion. I took days off from my freelance work for secret meetings with the real estate agent and the bank. I signed the papers with a hand that trembled, not from fear but from exhilaration. The day I got the keys, I sat on the dusty floor of my empty living room and cried, the letter from my grandmother clutched in my hand. This was the house she had told me to build. Lying in my bed after my father's disastrous birthday dinner, the full weight of my grandmother's wisdom settled over me. Hold on until it's your time. You will know when that is. This was it. This was the moment. The pain from the dinner was still raw, but underneath it, a new feeling was taking root, a cold, hard resolve. They thought they had crushed me. They had no idea that they had just handed me the one thing I was missing, the certainty that it was finally time to use my key. My preparation was over. The week that followed the birthday dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. An oppressive, suffocating silence descended upon our house. My parents and I moved around each other like ghosts, our conversations limited to curt, necessary exchanges. "Pass the salt! Is this your towel on the floor? I'm going out." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had happened. They were trying to wait it out, to let the tension dissipate until things could return to our twisted version of normal, where my pain was swept under the rug and their comfortable family dynamic was restored. They thought that if they ignored the wound, it would heal on its own. They didn't understand that their silence wasn't a bomb. It was an infection. Every shared silent meal was another confirmation of my isolation. Every time my mother flinched when I entered a room, every time my father buried his face deeper in his newspaper, they were reinforcing the verdict they had delivered at the restaurant. "You are not one of us." Danielle, meanwhile, was relentless. She began a campaign of smug, manipulative text messages. "Mom told me you were upset after the dinner. You really need to stop being so sensitive, Evie. I was just trying to help you be a part of the family for once." Another one read, "Hope you're thinking about my offer. It would be a really good way for you to show Mom and Dad that you're finally growing up." Each message was a small, condescending jab, designed to chip away at my resolve, to make me feel guilty and ungrateful. I didn't reply to any of them. My silence, for the first time, felt like a shield, not a weakness. The ambush came on a Saturday morning. I was in the kitchen enjoying a rare, quiet cup of coffee and sketching in my notepad. I was feeling a fragile sense of peace, planning the renovations for my duplex, dreaming of a future that was just around the corner. The sound of the front door opening shattered the calm. It was Danielle. She didn't knock. She walked in as if she owned the place, my parents trailing behind her like silent, grim-faced bodyguards. "We need to talk," Danielle announced, her voice sharp and authoritative. She placed her expensive leather briefcase on the kitchen table with a loud thud, scattering my pencils. I didn't move. I took a slow sip of my coffee, my heart starting to beat a little faster, but my hand was steady. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, my voice even. "Oh, I think there is," she said, snapping open the locks on her briefcase. She pulled out a thick stack of papers and slid them across the table towards me. They stopped right next to my sketchbook. It was a loan application. "I'm finalizing the mortgage for the condo, and I need a guarantor. And since you're not willing to contribute financially, the least you can do is sign." It was a breathtaking display of entitlement. She had publicly humiliated me, called me a parasite, and now she was demanding that I legally tie my financial future to hers. She was trying to reassert her dominance, to prove that she could still command my obedience. I looked from the papers to her smug face, then to my parents who were standing by the counter, their arms crossed, a united front of silent pressure. They were her backup, her enforcers. They were here to witness my surrender. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silent kitchen with the force of a thunderclap. It was a word I had never said to them before, not in this way, not with this finality. Danielle's smirk faltered. She blinked as if she hadn't heard me correctly. "What did you say?" "I said no," I repeated, and this time my voice was a little stronger. I looked directly at her. "I'm not signing anything." A flicker of disbelief, then anger, flashed across her face. "You can't be serious," she scoffed. "After everything this family has done for you? After Mom and Dad have let you live here for practically nothing for years? This is how you repay them? By being a selfish, ungrateful child?" She turned to my parents, her voice rising with theatrical indignation. "Are you going to let her get away with this? Are you going to let her sabotage my future because of some petty jealousy?" This was my father's cue. He stepped forward, assuming the role of the stern patriarch. His voice was low and heavy with disappointment, a tone he had used to control me my entire life. "Evelyn, that's enough. Your sister is right. We've supported you, and now it's your turn to support her. This is what a family does. We help each other. Stop being so difficult and just sign the papers." They were all looking at me, a trinity of expectation and judgment. They thought they had me cornered. They were so certain of their power over me, so accustomed to my compliance. They were waiting for me to fold, to lower my eyes and pick up the pen. But something inside me had fundamentally changed. The girl who had sat trembling at that restaurant a week ago was gone. In her place was a woman who had a set of keys in her purse and a deed hidden in her bedroom. The secret I had been keeping for 2 years was a suit of armor. Their words, which once had the power to shatter me, now glanced off it, harmless. I looked at my father, at his face, so full of righteous authority. I looked at my mother, her expression a mask of strained patience. I looked at my sister, her eyes glittering with a confident malice. I saw them for the first time, not as giants, but as small, limited people, trapped in a dysfunctional narrative they refused to abandon. I took a slow, deep breath, a cleansing breath that seemed to sweep away the last remnants of fear. I stood up from the table, my movements calm and deliberate. "No," I said for the third and final time. "You don't get to do this anymore. You don't get to crush me." I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving them standing there, stunned into a new kind of silence, the silence of utter, complete disbelief. My quiet refusal hung in the air, a declaration of war they had never anticipated. For a moment, the kitchen was frozen in a tableau of shock. Danielle's mouth was slightly agape, her look of smug certainty replaced by confusion. My mother's hands were clenched at her sides, and my father's face was slowly turning a dark, mottled red. They were accustomed to my tears, my quiet submission. This calm defiance was a language they didn't understand. "What did you just say to me?" Danielle finally sputtered, her voice rising in pitch. "You don't get to walk away from this. Get back here!" My father found his voice, and it was a low growl. "Evelyn, I am not going to tell you again. You will come back here and sign those papers. I am your father, and you will do as you are told." It was his trump card, the one he had always played, the appeal to an authority I had never been allowed to question. But I didn't stop. I walked up the stairs, my footsteps steady on the worn carpet. I could hear them following me, their movements clumsy with anger. "Don't you walk away when I'm talking to you!" Danielle shrieked from the bottom of the stairs. I went into my bedroom, the room I paid rent for, and walked to my closet. Tucked away in a shoebox on the top shelf, beneath old sketchbooks and art supplies, was a plain manila folder. It was my key, my declaration of independence. I took it down, my hands perfectly steady. The frantic, trapped bird in my chest was finally still. When I came back to the top of the stairs, they were all standing in the entryway below, looking up at me. Their faces were a mixture of fury and bewilderment. They looked like confused bullies, their victim having suddenly and inexplicably refused to play her part in their game. I walked down the stairs slowly, one step at a time, the folder held loosely in my hand. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel hateful. I felt a profound, almost serene sense of clarity. I was no longer a participant in their drama. I was an observer, seeing the toxic dynamic of my family with fresh, unclouded eyes. I stopped on the bottom step, putting me at eye level with them. I held out the folder. "You wanted me to contribute to the family," I said, my voice calm and even. "You wanted me to be responsible." I walked past them, back into the kitchen, and placed the folder on the table, right on top of Danielle's loan application. I opened it and took out a single folded document. I smoothed it out on the table. It was the deed to my duplex. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences I had endured. It was not the silence of abandonment or disapproval. It was the silence of pure, unadulterated shock. Danielle was the first to move. She snatched the paper off the table. Her eyes scanned the document, her brow furrowed in confusion. I watched as the color drained from her face, leaving her skin a pasty, sickly white. Her eyes darted from the legal description of the property to the official seal, and then to the top of the page, where my name was printed in bold, official type. "Owner, Evelyn Parker." "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. This has to be fake. This is impossible." My mother took the deed from Danielle's trembling hand. Her eyes, magnified by her reading glasses, moved slowly across the page. I saw a muscle twitch in her jaw. She looked up at me, her face a canvas of disbelief and something else, something that looked almost like fear. My father took the paper from her. He read it, then read it again. He looked at me, then back at the deed. He was speechless. The man who always had an answer, always had a lecture, was utterly silent. The foundation of his world, a world in which I was the dependent failure and Danielle was the shining success, had just crumbled into dust at his feet. "Where did you get the money for this?" he finally managed to ask, his voice raspy. I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need for his approval. "Grandma left it to me," I said simply. "She told me to use it to build a new house for myself, a place where I belonged." The mention of my grandmother was a strategic blow, and I knew it. My mother flinched as if I'd struck her. That was supposed to be family money," Danielle stammered, her voice cracking. "She had no right. You manipulated an old woman. You stole from this family." I almost laughed. The accusation was so absurd, so perfectly in character. I looked her dead in the eye. "No, Danielle," I said, my voice as cold and clear as ice. "You're the one who steals. You steal credit, you steal attention, and you tried to steal my future by demanding I underwrite yours." The difference is Grandma gave me a gift. All you know how to do is take. I then turned my gaze to my parents, the two people whose silence had caused me the most pain. This was my moment. This was my chance to finally say everything I had held inside for 31 years. You wanted to know why I wouldn't sign the papers? I said, my voice steady, gaining strength with every word. It's because of that night at the restaurant. It's because of every night you ignored me, every achievement you dismissed, every time you let her tear me down and you just sat there. Your silence told me everything I ever needed to know. I was never going to be enough for you. I was always going to be second best, the disappointment, the charity case. I took a deep breath, letting the final, liberating truth surface. So I stopped trying. I stopped waiting for you to see me, and I made myself enough. I built a life without your approval, without your help, without your permission. While you were so busy investing in her, I said, gesturing to my stunned sister. Grandma invested in me. I picked up my sketchbook and my coffee cup from the table. This is my 2 weeks' notice, I said, looking around the kitchen that had never felt like home. I'll be out by the end of the month. Don't worry, I added, a sliver of ice in my tone. I won't ask for my rent money back. Walking out of that kitchen was like walking out of a prison. I didn't storm out. I didn't slam the door. I simply turned my back on their shocked, silent faces and walked up the stairs. The spell was broken. Their power over me, an invisible, crushing weight I had carried my entire life, had evaporated in the face of one simple, undeniable truth, the deed to my own life. Held in my own hands, I spent the next 2 weeks packing. It was a methodical cleansing process. With every box I filled, I felt lighter. I sorted through the artifacts of my childhood, a life defined by being less than. I threw away old report cards that had been met with faint praise, participation trophies that had been dwarfed by Danielle's first-place awards, and old, tattered clothes that had been Danielle's hand-me-downs. It was an exorcism of a past I was finally ready to leave behind. My parents and I communicated through a thick, tense silence. They avoided me, their shame and anger a palpable presence in the house. They didn't know how to talk to me anymore. The old roles had been destroyed, and they had no script for this new reality where I wasn't their dependent, disappointing daughter. One evening, my mother knocked softly on my open bedroom door. I was wrapping my framed charcoal drawing of the old man from the park, the one that had won the honorable mention at the student art show all those years ago. She stood in the doorway, wringing her hands, her face etched with a confusion that bordered on grief. I don't understand, Evelyn, she said, her voice small and thin. Why did you hide all of this from us? We're your family. I stopped what I was doing and looked at her. The anger I had expected to feel wasn't there. All I felt was a deep, weary sadness. I hid it because you would have ruined it, I said, my voice gentle but firm. You would have called it a hobby. You would have told me to be practical. You would have tried to give the money to Danielle because she was the better investment. You would have crushed this one. Good thing just like you crushed everything else. I hid it to protect it. I hid it to protect myself from you. The truth hung in the air between us, stark and undeniable. She had no reply. She simply turned and walked away. The day I moved was gray and overcast, but to me it felt like the brightest day of my life. I had hired movers, and as they carried my boxes out of that house, I felt a profound sense of liberation. My father stood by the living room window watching, his face grim. He didn't come out to say goodbye. As I got into my car to follow the moving truck, he was still standing there, a silent, stubborn statue in the window of a life I was leaving behind. My new duplex was everything. It was quiet, it was mine, and it was filled with light. The first few weeks were a blur of joyful work. I painted the walls of my apartment a warm, sunny yellow. I bought a real bed, a comfortable sofa, and a dining table with 4 chairs, a symbol of a future filled with friends I would welcome into my home. I planted a garden in the backyard, digging my hands into the rich, dark earth. The storefront unit became my sanctuary. I sanded the old wooden floors, painted the walls a clean, crisp white, and set up my easels and work tables. I hung a simple hand-painted sign in the window, Warm Light Art Studio, classes and workshops. Within a month, I had my first group of students, a mix of neighborhood kids and curious adults. Their laughter and creative energy filled the space, chasing away the last of the ghosts from my past. I was not just surviving, I was thriving. I was building the life my grandmother had envisioned for me, a house where my light could fill every corner. The calls started about a month after I moved. First, it was my mother, her voice a strange mix of anger and pleading. Danielle is having trouble with the mortgage, she said, as if this were my problem to solve. The bank won't approve her without a guarantor. Your father and I are so stressed. You've done this to your sister. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply said, I'm sorry you're stressed, Mom. That is not my responsibility. I wish you all the best. And then I ended the call. I was setting a boundary, a concept so foreign to our family dynamic that it felt like speaking another language. My father sent a long, rambling email full of wounded pride and accusations. He called me ungrateful, selfish, and disrespectful. He wrote about all the sacrifices he had made for me, a list that was tragically short and filled with things like a roof over your head, which I had paid for. I read the email, and then I deleted it without replying. The final word from Danielle came in the form of a bitter, venomous text message, telling me that her deal for the condo had fallen through and it was all my fault. She called me a vindictive snake. I read the message, and for a moment the old sting of her words pricked at me. But then I looked around my sun-drenched studio, at the vibrant, joyful paintings the children from my morning class had left to dry, and I blocked her number. In the quiet months that followed, I found a new kind of peace. I began to understand what my grandmother had meant about forgiveness. I realized that the anger and resentment I held for my family was a chain, and I was the only one holding it. Forgiving them wasn't about letting them off the hook, or pretending that the decades of pain hadn't happened. It was about letting go of the chain. It was for me. I forgave them for not being the parents I needed. I forgave them for being blind. I forgave them so that their silence, their judgment, and their disappointment no longer had any power over me. I forgave them so that I could be truly, finally free. Sometimes, silence is the loudest betrayal. It's a quiet, insidious poison that can make you believe you are worthless, that you are invisible. For years, I let my family's silence define me. I shrank myself to fit into the tiny, cramped box they had built for me. But silence can also become the ground where you plant your own strength. The day I stopped waiting for them to speak up for me was the day I finally found my own voice. I chose peace over bitterness. I chose to build a new life out of the rubble of the old one. I chose myself. And I've learned that the most beautiful, resilient things can grow in the quietest, most unexpected places. What would you have done? Would you have fought back sooner? Or was the quiet revenge the right path? Like this video if you believe in the power of finding your own voice. Subscribe for more stories, and drop a comment about a time when silence spoke louder than words in your life. Thank you for listening.